Okay, shall we make a start? We're 5 minutes late already. We've got until 2 o'clock. If we go over, that'll be okay. I'm Jonathan Rutherford. I'm sort of organiser, head of the Future of the Left programme here at Policy Exchange. We've been going about since August 2024, and this is the 6th public talk we've organised. The kind of main aim of the talks is to try and understand the political and historical forces that are shaping the country rather than just focusing on particular policy issues. We want to try and make sense of what we might call the conjuncture of the present time. Thomas Carlyle wrote in his Signs of the Times essay in 1829, he also was trying to figure out what was going on in the Industrial Revolution. He said, instead of gazing idly into the obscure distance, let us look calmly around us for a little on the perplexed scene where we stand. I mean, it's quite good advice from him, and I don't think there's anybody more capable of this than John Gray, who's going to give the talk today. Philosopher, academic and public intellectual. So just let me say a little bit about John. He grew up in a working class family in South Shields, and after grammar school went to Oxford University, where he became disillusioned with the left during the student protests of the 1970s. He moved to the Hayekian New Right and became associated with the early Thatcherites. His shifting politics has been defined by scepticism and a constant willingness to challenge universal belief systems. His distinguished academic career began at Oxford and concluded at the LSE, and it could be defined as a long argument with liberalism, with John Stuart Mill, who turned liberalism into a secular religion, with his belief in individuality as a higher state of humanity, with Thomas Hobbes, both liberal and trenchant critic of liberalism, who understood the tragedy of human life, and only a strong Leviathan state would ensure society did not descend into the terror of anarchy, and also more contemporary, with the hyperliberalism of today, the belief in the self-realization without constraint, this rise of what became known as woke that came across from America, like liberalism, is a legacy of the Christian providential story, which will end with the city on the hill. John has also written presciently about post-liberalism years before it found its way into wider political discourse. And in his most recent essay in The New Statesman, he takes issue with contemporary post-liberalism. Human beings need shelter from the anarchical forces of the global market, including mass immigration. The error is thinking safety can be found in communities. It's an opinion which provoked plenty of disagreement from post-liberals and conservatives alike. John took early retirement to concentrate full-time on his writing, and he's published a series of thought-provoking books to great critical acclaim. His latest is the new Leviathans, which I recommend, if you haven't read it, to read it. John evades definitions, easy definitions, and doesn't fit neatly into the conventional political categories. He writes about literature and culture, politics, as well as the conundrums of philosophy, about human nature and our animal selves. He writes on the threshold of what is passing, when nothing is replacing it yet, and when we are empty of meaning. We might describe John, therefore, as a philosopher of the aftermath, of what is passing into history, what it has left behind, and what this might portend for the future. And his futures are often not ones we want to contemplate, because they do not fit with our heartfelt hopes and prejudices. So John will speak on what comes after progressivism for about 20-25 minutes. I'll then ask him a few questions, and then we'll open up to questions on the floor. John, are you going to sit? Do you want to sit there? Okay.
Can you all hear me? Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that very generous and even more surprisingly quite accurate account of my views and my way of thinking about politics. I'll begin with a quote. It's from a slightly unsavory Russian reactionary thinker who lived through the Bolshevik Revolution. And he wrote, Russia faded out in 2 days, at most 3. And of course the Romanov regime was a cruel despotism, but it's a reminder, this observation from direct experience, that history moves quickly. Liberal Britain, in the good old-fashioned sense of a country in which different faiths and values and religions and communities could rub along together, has, I think, faded out in a couple of months. There are various events have led to this one in particular. We all know that public spaces and services are unsafe. That didn't used to be the case. You don't have to be very old to remember a time when you didn't have to walk into a railway station with a strong sense of vigilance about being pickpocketed. You didn't have to get on a train with the thought that you might be stabbed in a crazed attack. Ubiquitous knife crime, drug use, lawlessness in all our major cities. It's a different country from the one all of us here, I suppose, grew up in. But the one event, I think, which symbolized this and concentrated it was the Manchester synagogue attack of a while ago in October. There must have been people, I was one, who anticipated that something like this would happen. On the other hand, it changed radically, I think, our perception and our sense of the sort of country we live in. There's been academic dispute about when Jews in this country were attacked for being Jews last, but there's nothing like this in living memory, and probably not even in the 20th century, despite Mosley and all the rest of it. It's a new world. And I don't think it stops there. The danger is that it'll become normalized, as I think anti-Semitism has become renormalized on both ends of the political spectrum. In fact, even in the middle. Things could easily get worse. So that's my beginning, how I begin by saying that there has been this change, symbolized with a long history, of course. And where does the history of this start? Now, I'll probably offend some people here, or at least spark them to irritated thought when I say that I think it might have begun with a great leader, Margaret Thatcher. Because Thatcher herself was a strong opponent of progressivism in most of its meanings. I'll come back to what it means briefly. But in a paradox she never fully understood, I think. Her policies, her economic shock therapy, which didn't kill off traditional industries, they've been declining for a long, long time, according to some historians, Curley, Barnett and others, at least since the end of the 19th century. But she accelerated their decline, and the regions and cities and communities that used to be dependent on them were basically left on life support. And in the decades that followed, they became what they now are, which is post-industrial, drug-ridden wastelands of worthlessness and despair. The working class communities of the kind that I'm proud to say I grew up in, don't exist anymore. And I don't think they're coming back either. So we have to adapt to what this situation is. Thatcher herself had a bit of cognitive dissonance about all this. Some of you may remember, I think it was in the 1997 party conference when she found a model of a British Airways plane where the tail fins, which had used to bear the Union flag, had been replaced by some global image nonsense. And she tried to cover it up with bits of paper that she constructed for the purpose. She didn't see any connection between the policies that she'd pursued and this kind of transformation. She didn't see that a certain kind of globalization of markets had helped to erode the communities that she admired, rightly admired, hardworking, patriotic British communities. She didn't understand that, I think, to her dying day. But she's not unusual in that respect, because I think it's a feature of practically every part of the political spectrum that they don't understand their role in it. If I can start with something more, if I can mention something more topical just briefly, I'm sure we're all fascinated by it. The response of the BBC, of the senior echelons of the BBC to the Telegraph revelations has been a classic case of cognitive deficiency. The key element in it all is that these revelations can only be interpreted as a conspiracy, a right-wing coup. That's what people always invoke when they can't understand what's going on around them. But it's particularly ironical and telling when they can't perceive their own role in the situation that they're now engulfed in. And this is a general feature of progressivism. If you look at progressives in this country, in America and elsewhere, I'm just thinking of the normal range of people, I needn't name them, their response to what they call populism, which is essentially a political form of political blowback, I've argued, against the social disruption produced by their policies, is expressions of horror, how appalling it is, how diabolical it is, how everything is being stirred up by wicked, evil demagogues. They had no role at all in this. They just stand back, horrified spectators. And you say, well, might it have something to do with incompetence like the financial crisis of 2007 and 8? Might it have something to do with open door immigration policies? Might it have something to do with what has been popularly but not inaccurately called two-tier justice? They look at you with genuine bafflement. And I think this is an important thing to understand, because I suspect there are a few genuine cynics in the BBC. Cynics are rare, almost as rare as saints. You can only be a cynic if you have a taste for truth, and that's extremely rare. Most people believe the nonsense they spout when they spout it, and progressives are classic examples of this. But the result of these revelations about what is undoubtedly systemic bias, not individual, occasional, intermittent lapses of judgment, is that they're digging in, and I think they're digging in because they can't really process what they've done, because what they have done is to represent the world, represent events in the Middle East and elsewhere, as embodying their pre-existing worldview, their pre-existing picture of the world. If they gave that up, they would give up a whole worldview which, as Jonathan said earlier on, for them has the status of a faith or a religion. It's a secular faith or religion. So it would be a catastrophic cognitive collapse, but of course it would also affect their positions, their careers, their incomes, their employment. They would have to see that they'd been making terrible errors, they'd have to be seen that what they'd been doing was actually broadcasting a kind of a political project, a political program, a political worldview and ideology, rather than doing what a public service broadcaster really should do, which is to try and represent the world truthfully. And yet, I think, and I speak as someone who for 20 years broadcast talks on BBC Radio 4, I broadcast in favour of Brexit during and after Brexit. I was never actually lent on or censored in any way during that period. So it's not completely monolithic, but in recent times, the programme I appeared on was abruptly discontinued a few months ago. The BBC has become an organisation defined by its progressivism, defined by its worldview. It's hard for me to see how it can survive in its present form without a fundamental alteration in staff and membership, and really almost a radical transformation, which is almost impossible to imagine. So I think we're in doubt about an institution which has been in the past a great institution. I don't know if any of you have read the wonderful novel by Penelope Fitzgerald called Human Voices. She worked at the BBC during the Second World War. It's a very moving, profound novel about how they really tried to tell as much of the truth as they could, despite the wartime restrictions and censorship, which they knew were necessary. You could almost say something opposite to that has emerged now. So I'm not, au fond, an enemy of the BBC, but I don't see how really I can't easily imagine how it can now survive.
Can you just speak up a bit?
Oh, I'll try and speak up a bit, yeah. So how we got there, I talked about Margaret Thatcher, argued that her economic shock therapy dissolved the country she took for granted. Her disciples were Blair and Cameron. They were different because I think, certainly in the case of Blair, Thatcher was a sort of unknowing instrument of the dissolution of old liberal Britain. Blair and Cameron, to a lesser extent, were consciously deconstructing it. Blair clearly regarded mass immigration as a way of advancing Britain to the condition he thought the whole world would then achieve, which is one in which religious allegiances, national allegiances might still exist, but they'd become a bit like tastes in ethnic cuisine. They'd be marginalized from politics. I wouldn't count. It was exactly the opposite of what then happened, of course, but I don't think he's changed his view. People don't change these types of views. Where are we now? Well, the Starmer government kind of is a complicated thing. Others present will know a lot more about it than I do, but it's a kind of blend, it seems to me, of old-fashioned progressivism, almost of the progressivism of Blair, which had its own roots in America, in Clintonite politics, but even further back in the British Fabians and so on, with human rights fundamentalism and a cult of managerialism. And of course, they're connected because both human rights fundamentalism and managerialism essentially want to take a lot of contested issues out of politics and have them arbitrated, decided by expert judgment. And but a lot of these issues reflect deep conflicts in society about the value of human life, about immigration, about assisted dying, and many other issues, and about the importance of place. Some people think that's very important, as I do myself. Others think of it as an atavistic relic, always a tacit form of racism and exclusion and so on. So there isn't, I think, managerialism of that kind never had much of a chance of succeeding, but it has in fact been extraordinarily incompetent as well as anything else, especially under the Starmer regime. Like many forms of progressivism, it doesn't work. So what's happening now? Where are we now? Now, I think the key thing, which is relatively new, is that what you might call the failures of this historic form of progressivism, the failures of the Democrats, the Clintonites and Bidenites in America, and here now of Starmer, is producing what I've called the type of liberalism that's prevailed in the last 20 years, hyperliberalism. Well, I think what's emerging now is hyper-progressivism. In Mamdani, in New York, and in Britain, in the Greens, and also, of course, in Corbyn's party. And I think that will be a powerful motor of the next phase of this and the next phase of development, because it has two important features which make it that. One is that it mobilizes the ideology, the progressive ideology, the anti-Western progressive ideology that millions of young people have been taught at universities and schools. Basically, what was a hobby of tenured professors has become a mass philosophy. So there are millions and millions of young people who do this, and there's a second feature which adds up to a very combustible and explosive compound. Many of these young people have legitimate criticisms and objections and discontents about their position in society. They can't afford to live anywhere. They can't afford to found a family. They see no chance for self-improvement and so on. So this combination is, I think, tremendously powerful, and it's produced a sweeping victory in New York. Some people say this will be short-lived. I doubt it. I think the more absurd it becomes, the longer it will last. The leader of the Green Party has recently said that he would negotiate with Putin. Well, Trump has tried that, tried to flatter him. He's not flatterable. He may be susceptible to hypnotherapy, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. I slightly doubt it, actually. Something in his training might actually work against that. But the more absurd it is, the more it will be an enduring and possibly even expanding part of our political landscape, because the way that cognitively disoriented people react to a world they find unintelligible and frighteningly unintelligible is to find sense by immersing themselves in nonsense, like conspiracy theories on the right and other things. And there, by the way, I'll just say something briefly about those of us who I suppose find ourselves on the right, which is that I'm seriously concerned about certain tendencies on the right, especially in America, whereby all the old tropes about anti-Semitism have re-emerged in the form through various spokespeople, broadcast in shows which have millions and millions of watchers, under the heading of Christian nationalism. And I think that that's code for anti-Semitism, basically. And it's not a small marginal thing. I can't give an estimate. I've read online that some polls have been taken, and it might be 30 or 40% of people who identify themselves as MAGA are sympathetic to this. So it's not small. And when Trump goes, I mean, at the moment there are lots of struggles between within MAGA on immigration and policies on healthcare and also on the response to the Epstein revelations. When Trump grows or becomes weaker, I think these forces will become stronger, because that's where a lot of the energy is now in MAGA. So just as I think the political energy now, not so much the intellectual energy, there's not much of that, but the political energy is increasingly with hyper-progressivism. I think the political energy on the right in America looks like being more radical forms of populism. Now here again, we've got to try and understand the present to, rather than model it in the past. I've seen lots of people refer, including Trump, Mamdani's a communist, so on. He's not a communist in any, that would be too rigorous a form of thinking for him to adopt. It's an amalgam or a pastiche of anti-plutocrat economics with radical multiculturalism and Islamism, shaped in a form that serves the economic interests of what is being called the professional middle classes. That's to say, I guess in New York, people earning over 100,000 who can't afford childcare. Others may benefit from it, lots will be hurt by it. And for everything we know from history as to how hard rent controls function, for just to take one example, and also because it's a very mobile society, people can leave easily and go to Florida and so on. If he persists with his policies and doesn't back off with his promises, then the city will be hollowed out, I think, in a few years. The talent will have moved in. You'll have a desperate third worldist or fourth worldist type of city replacing what New York once was. And here I just make one side issue. He's not a socialist or a communist, but it would help if our young people had actually been taught something about the history of communism, not only as an engine of mass killing on a huge scale, but also because of its economic results. So it's the same everywhere. Same in Cuba, same in Mongolia, same in Russia, same in the Czech Republic, which were basically, except in a few fields where the technology was largely stolen, or economic stagnation, particularly for working people, and the control of housing by the nomenklatura. Basically, if it's entirely politically controlled, it gets distributed by the nomenklaturas, their families, and they interest anybody who knows anything about life in the communist bloc will recognize that. And there won't be complete control because it's in New York, it's only one city, and people will move, but the result will be an evacuation of energy and deeper impoverishment. That can be predicted, but remember, first of all, young people haven't been taught this. I doubt that there's a single course, even perhaps in a British university, on the history of communism in these respects, certainly not in schools. Their worldview is modelled by the follies, some of which were real, and crimes, some of which were real, but of colonialism and imperialism, and nothing else, basically, so there's nothing to compare it with. But also, I think it's tough for them to take on, and I understand this. We should have sympathy with the idea that this is all snake oil, basically. That it gives them no hope at all, actually, real hope. It's hard for them to say, but that, I think, is what it is. It's after that. So where does this leave us now? I'll just make a couple of comments before I close. I don't think the rise of hyper-progressivism has been fully understood, really, on the right yet, and what it means. One thing I think it means is that any idea that the right can save itself and society by a reversion to Thatcherite market liberalism is a mistake. Not just because people blame Thatcher, not always correctly, but because of this phenomenon that Thatcherism and radical market liberalism was self-defeating in certain ways. I knew Hayek, and he often used to say, socialism is destroyed by its self-defeating consequences. He was right, actually, about that. It didn't occur to him that freeing up markets could suffer the same irony, and that actually could produce populism and could produce many of the phenomena we now face. And so I've noticed in Farage, he's dropped, partly for good reasons, including fiscal crisis. He's aware of something which is absolutely real, which is that Britain is sliding like as America is, but we're much more exposed to a fiscal meltdown of some kind or other. He's right about that, absolutely right about that, as is Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party. They're absolutely right about that. But it's a mistake, I think, for Farage to back off completely from some of the earlier slightly leftish economics that he was proposing only a few weeks or months ago. Because they're, not just because they're popular, but they speak to real needs of abandoned people. They speak to real needs of young people and older people too, who see no hope at all. If you just say what we need is another dose. I mean, Brexit wasn't won because people were secretly reading Ayn Rand in Blythe. There wasn't much call for Hayek up there, as I remember it. It was won because people wanted shelter from these forces, particularly immigration, but not only that. Now, you might say that's a kind of atavistic demand, but we live in a world in which there is no global free market. Market liberalism is a nonsense in a world that contains Xi's China. A vast mercantilist behemoth. You seem to be wiped out if there was full-scale free trade. So I think we need to think, those of us who identify, and also on the left too, because on the left there's still a kind of idea, a kind of nostalgia for, rules-based global order. Well, that's gone. Not coming back either. Trump has seen to that, whatever his achievements in other respects, including disrupting the BBC. But that's not coming back. So we need, I think, to be self-critical. Where does that leave us, sort of, as it were, what's next? Well, people ask me, I'm not a psephologist, and I think psephology has its limitations too, but I can think of a deeply hung parliament after the next election, which may well be before 2029 and almost certainly under a different Labour leader. But I can well imagine a 7-party hung parliament, with maybe the Reform being the biggest group, but surrounded by all these other groups who might try and form a popular front against it, and so on. So there could be another iteration of progressivism, which would be more radical than we've had so far, because the 7-party parliament would contain a substantial, I believe, green representation, substantial Islamist and independent, and your party, or whatever it by then is called. It's called, so it would be pushed to the left, so you could have another period. Then it would break down for all the reasons, which fiscal incapacity, unsustainability, and possibly, sadly, war, because I mean, Russia is, it seems from everything, they already regard themselves as being essentially at war with parts of Europe. So finding how can we get out of this situation. I think I'm going to be interrogated on that by Jonathan more. I think the way out, with one huge caveat, is a sovereign parliament, a more sovereign parliament, which does not devolve its authority to quangos, or which is less fettered, much less fettered by present interpretations of human rights, which, rather like the BBC, have become the vehicle of a particular project. They're not human rights protections as they were at the end of the Second World War, which all reasonable people can agree with. They're now, it's an explicit political project. I think that has to come one way or another. There may be changes in the electoral system if the depth of the hung parliament makes forming a secure coalition difficult. If a reform-led government does emerge, it may not last very long, because despite its realism over fiscal issues, immigration is not a problem that can be solved overnight. It's a very difficult and deep problem, and I am alarmed too by certain tendencies on the right, in which they're talking about, some people are talking about mass deportations of people who've been here legally for decades. I think it's completely unconscionable, as well as impracticable. I think we might be reasonable to have a zero net immigration policy as soon as possible, as it were. But talking about kicking people out who've been here working legally under rules which we then declare are invalid is, I think, totally not on. If that's done, that's another mistake that the right could do. But the big problem of a sovereign parliament is that it may be completely misguided. Some of you may remember what happened about the first and second readings of the Climate Act back in, 2008? It went through near unanimously. I think there were 5 or 6 dissidents in the first reading and 3 in the second. I mean, remember what this was. It was that industrial civilization was going to be reinvented in 20 or 25 years. When we didn't have the technologies, we didn't have the raw materials, the Chinese had them, we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have anything with which to do. I'm not a climate skeptic. I think climate skepticism is real and anthropogenic. This was completely nonsensical, completely, yet only half a dozen people spoke against it. So the political class has yet to adapt to reality. The political class, almost right across the closest it comes, I think, actually is infrared to doing that, and some sections of the Conservative Party, but the political class as a whole will have to be shaken up, and it may be that we need a larger crisis than any we've had so far to produce that cognitive breakthrough. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So, what is to be done? If I was a political strategist in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, after listening to you, I'd really be wondering about that. And I think the state of the governing class, or whatever you want to call it, is they don't know what to do. I don't think they know what they're doing. I don't think they can admit to it. And until you admit to the fact that you don't know what you're doing,
even
you can't
admit to
figure
yourself.
out.
You mean?
Sorry?
Even admit to yourself. Do they
Well, even admit. I don't think anybody admits it to themselves. Even at the moment, you certainly can't admit it to each other. I don't think there are any of these kind of conversations going on in Labour at the moment. We can see the repeated mistakes and they went into government sort of empty-handed. So it's like the political system is like a centrifuge. It's forced energy to the extremes of left and right, who don't have the possibility of having the sort of state levers at hand. Those who have got the possibility, the Conservatives and the Labour, they're zombies, really. They're zombie party. They're intellectually hollowed out. You sort of like alluded to maybe another crisis about what that will actually sort of like prompt people into figuring out what to do. But can you say anything more about
well, I
this?
think partly I'll just echo what you've seen. In the last few days, we've seen Starmer, among others, reverting to progressive type by representing Farage and his supporters, the largest single group of potential voters in the country, as racists. Now, you'd think that after all this time, they would have avoided that. No. Why haven't they avoided it? You can't help it. It's like the frog and the scorpion. You're going, you say, well, if you keep going on like that, you'll drown. Well, I'm a scorpion. But they haven't got that sense in the old. They haven't. Basically, that's what their instincts still are. They've been masked by rhetoric, by advisors giving perhaps good advice, but it hasn't worked because they're not good enough mimics of positions that they don't hold. Their real view is that anyone who thinks of voting for Farage is a racist, must be a racist. How can they not be a racist? In other words, once again, you see, they dissociate themselves from the phenomena that they themselves helped to produce. Mass immigration at these levels, at this speed, embracing such a wide range of different communities coming here, was bound to have some consequences similar, and did in Sweden and other countries in Europe, including France. But none of that is relevant to them. They're impeccably virtuous. They're the most enlightened and the most intelligent generation in the entire history of the species, remember. Pascal, Augustine, Maimonides, they're all bumbling fools who need awakening and enlightening. They're more intense. So they can't really shed this without completely shedding their picture of themselves in the world. So they don't know, but they've reverted to type, and I think this will do two things. One is it will, of course, be a gift to Farage. It's one of the psychological factors that drives it is that people who vote for them do so because he doesn't despise them. The other is it will strengthen hyper-progressivism too, because it won't satisfy the soft left in Labour. They want a larger swift, a larger move away from the kind of policies that Shabana Mahmood is now proposing, Danish model on immigration. They want to kill that in the water if they possibly can. If they don't, they'll hive off in their views to factions and voters who, there are probably about 15 or 20% of the voting classes in Britain who share the Green leader's view that Putin's just a bit misguided. Slightly misguided. If you just explain to him, a lot of people are suffering in Ukraine. He said, well, nobody told me. It's like the Tsar, nobody told me what was happening. I'll fire them all. Nothing like that, but there are like 20% of the population, and that might become 22% in these circumstances. In that case, that kind of makes an even bigger uncertainty. So this response of the present government, I think, which here's my guess as an outsider. If we have this meeting 2 or even 3 months from now, there'll be a lot of changes will have happened in between that quickly. Looks like to me. Certainly within a year. Can't imagine, in less than a year. They can't understand it because they can't understand their role in producing the situation that is engulfing them now. Obviously there are contingencies here. Epstein's a big one, I think. That's an example of something, so to speak, outside of politics, which has had huge ripples through America, and still does in America because it's deepening the what's the word I'm looking at? The fragmentation of MAGA. You promised to release the files. Why not? Why aren't you doing it? And so on. A big issue, I think, in America, and it's already had ripple effects in Britain. But the underlying logic is that when they're confronted by a world they partly shape, they don't understand their own role in it, and won't. So this will pass away. There will be a move to more radical forms of progressivism, more primitive thinking, more conspiracy thinking. It's already really wild in America on the internet. Who killed Charlie Kirk? Well, must have been Mossad. Probably millions of people will actually believe that. I think it's a dangerous time we're moving into, but maybe you wanted a glimmer of hope.
No, I don't mind not having the hope bit, because the first step for anybody trying to figure out how to get out is to actually understand the society they're living in. Yes. So a lot of people think that we are sort of like fragmented and very individualised, but you've got a slightly different view, haven't you, about it being sort of identity groups and communal conflicts.
Well, I think what's emerged is not a radically individualistic society on the whole, but a society I've called it quasi-militarized, if any of you know what that means, the millets of the Ottoman Empire, or quasi-Balkanized, or people from the Balkans don't like that expression, into different groups against the background in which inherited collective identities like the nation state have been delegitimated and deconstructed. People do need, people do need some kind of conception of themselves. And if the ones which are historically inherited have been actively demolished, they'll seek for others. So instead of thinking of oneself as British or English or whatever, they'll think of themselves in terms of a self-defined identity, which could relate to their gender or to their political positions on the Middle East or whatever. And you then have a kind of sectarianized politics like that in Northern Ireland, but with a crucial difference, because in Northern Ireland, peace of a kind was eventually achieved through the agency of the British state over a period of 20 or 30 years and many governments. Without that, there wouldn't have been the peace. This is the British state which is now weakened partly by the logic of elections in marginal seats, which can be determined by these new parties, which are defined by foreign policy issues. I mean, Irish, if you go back, I mean, it's not the first time in history that people have talked about the end of liberal England. There was George Dangerfield's famous book, Strange Death of Liberal England, which I think came out 90 years ago in 1935. But he was mainly talking about the Liberal Party. The only form of nationalism which was really relevant then was Irish nationalism. Suffragism played a certain role. But actually what happened out of that was not that liberal England vanished. It persisted for another 70 years or so, when it began to unravel, I think, as part in the period of Blair, and even much more recently at an accelerating pace. So it's not the same as then. And another crucial difference, by the way, between then and now, is that intermediate institutions have not been comprehensively captured the way they are now. And I think here we've got to be careful. I think this might be relevant to your question, Jonathan, about thinking that a vibe shift in the media against woke does not mean that progressive ideology is weaker in the institutions it's captured. They're deeply embedded, for example, research funding for universities, museums, cultural organizations, deeply embedded there. And they're going to hang on because they appoint their successors if they possibly can. It's not something that reacts in these institutions. Most of them don't respond much to market forces or even to shifts in public mood. They just sort of peg on, as in the BBC. So then you have to start thinking about, as I say, I'm not one of those people on the right who like to think of burning institutions to the ground, or I think wherever possible we should repair them. But then basically a point may come when you think they've got to be disestablished and cut loose. If they're not self-reformable, then something radical has got to be done. And by the way, it might be that part of this is a semi-exogenous factor, technology, because the impact of technology will be to make many of these members of the so-called knowledge classes, who, by my observations and experience, know practically nothing about anything. What they know is a certain patois, a certain vernacular which has been applied to them, a certain discourse in which they can describe themselves. They can be stripped out quickly by AI. It's a much better mimic than they are of this discourse. So that kind of progressive hegemony, if you like, is not there anymore. We're not living in a time when the progressives are hegemonic, but they are deeply embedded all over the place, and they have a role in recycling these ideologies, which of course are more and more at variance with the actual world, more and more cognitively weak and flawed. but they still carry on. I don't know if that did answer what you were asking.
Shall we get some questions from, we've got 10 minutes. Do people want to ask any questions? Could you just say your name and where you come from, please? René.
Hi, René.
And here. Do you want to, sorry, hang on a minute. Do you want to take a number at a time or just one?
Maybe 2 or 3 at a time.
2 or 3,
because
okay.
we need at least a few.
Yeah. And somebody else? Yeah, sorry, with the pink shirt. And one other person? Yeah. Okay, René.
Yeah, hi, René and Jay. Great talk, as usual. With regard to the future and the potential political landscape, I was intrigued by your claim that actually Thatcherism is dead. But I would want to posit...
No, it wasn't. It was that like a vampire. It's risen from the grave.
It could rise. But I wanted to posit actually that actually could be the only way in which the Conservative Party can get back. I mean, it seems like that is the direction in which they're going, although it's not necessarily helping them in the polls. They've got a lead on the economy. We're seeing also with the British Social Attitude Survey that actually people's views on tax and spend is probably at its most right-wing in the last 40-odd years. So it could be that could be fertile ground. Also, similarly, on the point of Keir Starmer and racism against reform, although instinctively I agree, if you look at the polls, the majority of voters do think reform is racist, and the majority of white British voters, interestingly enough, strangely, I think wrongly, think reform is a racist party. So if they were to, could it be that actually the prior strategy of going outside of their instincts and trying to do something which isn't really what they believe, like with the Island of Stranger speech, actually that didn't work, and actually the government strategy going forward may be to redouble on a kind of centrist progressivism, and that this sort of vampire politics is just going to keep going on and on and on and on and on.
There's a microphone coming up.
Oh, thanks. Daniel Johnson, the article. John, you started by saying that liberal Britain had faded out in a couple of months. Very dramatic. Is there any place then in that kind of Britain for a moderate centre-right liberal conservative party of the kind that we have had up to now, the kind that Kemi Badenoch represents, or will the British Conservative Party go the same way as Christian Democrat parties in Europe, the old Republican Party in America? Is it all going to be just swept away?
And one more.
Good afternoon. Subhash Perumal. There is a paradox in praying at the altar of managerialism is still required when you are administering a state of 35%, 40% of GDP. The Leviathan needs to be run by someone. In a future world reimagined by the right or the left or whatever replaces it, what does that mean for the administration of the state?
Thank you. I'll answer them all three if I can, and I'll start with Daniel Johnson's. I think there is still room in this country for a centre-right party which avoids the extremes we mentioned. But if it has only a Thatcherite agenda, which is cutting the size of the state and the freeing up markets, it won't work. Because there are, I support the proposal, if it could be done, of abolishing stamp duty. Tremendous, actually, one of the worst taxes there are. Although when it was done in New Zealand, its effect, by the way, was to increase, there was another house price surge, which left young people even more out. So it's not necessarily a panacea, but I support it all the same. But that kind of policy, in and of itself, won't be enough to do much for the coastal cities, the regions and towns which are sunk in post-industrial social decay. Something more has got to be done. One thing I've thought of, but I don't know whether it's practical or not, is that the defence industry, which depleted and even going to be cut actually under the present government, could somehow be used to expand in areas and provide meaningful employment, meaningful productive activity. I mean, it's something that you wouldn't need to spend new money on and so on. But I definitely don't think that the argument that this is a wholly different circumstance than that in which Thatcher acted, and the world she existed is wholly different. There are large parts of the population, young people, but also old people who've been abandoned, who would not necessarily take well to Xavier Millet-like slashing of the state. I mean, I know he's proceeded, I know he's recovered politically recently, but remember, he has the immense advantage of 100 years of failure behind him. They've been ruined and re-ruined dozens of times. We haven't got that now. We don't have to wait 100 years. We won't have to wait because everything's accelerated. But I think even though big cuts are going to come, I think they'll come maybe through a fiscal crisis. A party which there are serious difficulties about making them the centre of the programme and not offering something, not having the state do something more than simply be an enabling mechanism for a revived market. So that's what I think. The second one was about the administration. Well, of course, that's the weakness of reform. They haven't got the skills, they don't know how to do it. They haven't had the experience. So if you sweep away the old managerial class, who's going to take? I suppose what we have to rely on is careerism. That's to say, when they see that the game is up, if they have any real skills at administering and managing, when they sit, then they'll switch. I mean, that's what's happened in other countries. Not always been benign in its results, but the communist nomenclatura didn't just resign and become subsistence farmers in Peru or something. They took over the privatization process in their own interests and took over a lot of the political parties. That's not a good example, but I think a key thing would be actually to persuade some of these echelons that they should help in actually having more effective public services. That they, not just saying we've got to get rid of them all. And I think one misleading way of talking about it is elites versus masses. I think you can overdo that, actually. If you talk about elites, well, does it include all the graduates? Rather large elite, I would say, vast. Does it include everyone who works in public services? Well, if it does, you'll sack them all. Then you really will be in your situation. You can't do without elements of the administrative state, and you can't suddenly get rid of it in 10 minutes either. So the earlier question, can you repeat the earlier question, Paddy? It's a very good one.
Wasn't the question?
Well, I think I chiefly did two, but on the first one on Thatcherism, which you just alluded to.
Oh yes, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was basically arguing that actually could be a route for the centre right, because if you look at they're leaving polls in the economy, which is anything they're leaving on. The stamp duty policy, that actually had a small uptick in the polls. The BSA poll shows that actually people are more right-wing than they've ever been since the mid 1980s on tax and spend. But also in terms of the racism thing with Labour and reform, actually if you look at the polls, most voters and even most white British voters, and also a quarter of Conservative voters, think reform is a racist party. And actually, when Stan was doing all this sort of island stranger stuff, that actually didn't help in the polls. In fact, it declined in the polls, and it didn't have any credibility. So actually, going back to the instincts which you criticise, actually might be a way for the government to
I think that's a very good question, excellent question. But I think the impact on the polls now is relatively slight. I mean, that's to say, I don't think there's a big majority in any cohort for massive public service cutting, is there really? Especially when it starts to be experienced. You actually find that parts of the National Health Service you took for granted have just been, not only do you have to wait for them, they won't be there at all. I'm not convinced that there would be. We'd have to do something else pretty quickly or at the same time to enable. Now that might be Thatcherite, that you might be extending income tax relief to people who go privately, which did exist for a while in this country and then was abolished. But I think you'd need to do more, and there's also what people say in response to polls and how they vote. I mean, many of these people who say that Farage is rather racist might go out and vote for him. There's the anonymity of the voting booth, what they really feel and really want, especially if they experience some of the social side effects of the sudden arrival in the towns or cities of large numbers of mostly young men who haven't got employment and don't seem about to get it very soon. So There's that discrepancy too. I just feel that there is but also, the key thing is the world order she took for granted has gone. The world order was when in her life, it was still binary for most of it, but not long after she left power, it became something like a global free market. China moved in and seemed about to join in the global free market rules and all the rest of it, and so I don't think they ever intended to do that. But that world is completely gone. This could only be sensible if you believe that Trump will be followed by a reversion to Clintonism or Bidenism. I think that's I don't say it's impossible. It's the least likely, almost unfathomably unlikely outcome. I think it's more likely that he will be followed by a more radical populist of the right, just as I think that the Democrats will get back. I mean, Nikki Haley was the last gasp of all that. Will get back by aping populism from a left-wing perspective. I mean, Peronism with Islamist characteristics, if you like. Something like that appeals. It won't sell in the blue-collar Midwest where I lived for a while, so it won't travel everywhere, but it might work in other cities, which have been, and errors and mistakes that the Trump might assist that. I don't think that. So it only makes sense that in a world which is gone, which is as remote from us. It's not. I remember. I'm old enough to remember. Some of you will remember that. But I think it's irretrievably gone. So because what we do about how this free market, would it be insulated from the world? Would it be? Originally, I thought that Trump would be the free market in one country. It isn't even that, because he's now taking major stakes in companies. Something completely different, actually. He's fusing crypto with the state, with the dollar, actually, with the dollar. And by the way, that may turn out to be a weakness of the Farage position, because he's positioned the party as the crypto party. What if there may not be, but what if there's a big crypto meltdown? Embracing these new right ideas. It's new thinking of a kind, if you like, but the American example doesn't necessarily fit our experience any more than European examples fully fit our experience. So I think in some respects what you say is true, but I don't think there's enough voting. I say I'm not. It doesn't seem. I'm not a psephologist, but there isn't enough in the community. There isn't among the voters. For many voters, were born after Thatcher died. What they know about Thatcher is being filtered through to them by the rest. So that she's a monster. She was a great leader, but like most great leaders or all great leaders, there was there were unintended consequences and even self-defeating consequences in what she did. They don't understand any of that. So you've got to say, what story will you tell? If you tell a Thatcherite story, I don't think it'll get traction. That's what I'm saying. Stories about Mam Damni's stories. As I say, the more nonsensical, the more the more leverage they've got. Because they can't. So I think you do need a narrative. You don't just need an analysis. You don't just need to say, well, we've studied Stockholm in 1937 to 38, and the effect of rent controls was really terrible. I don't think that will work in New York. You have to have a story which somehow links up with people's actual circumstances and offers them more than fear as well. It's not enough to say it'll be even worse under all this. It will be. But that's not enough. That doesn't exactly energize people to resist it. Then they just think about moving or giving up, or you have to promise some of these young people particularly something better than they've got or than they've been expecting, something that mobilizes them into. I don't think Thatcherism could do that, but others will disagree.
John, we've reached the end of the time. Do you want to take two more, or do you want to
Well,
stop?
have you got time? I'm happy to if anybody wants to.
Two more questions, and fairly quick, please.
Quick answer.
Man with the glasses at the back there. Yeah. and Ryan, yeah.
Quite a lot of how you described sort of progressivism, it seemed that it was like dependent on relatively benign external conditions.
Absolutely.
And I wondered how much of this was really to do with the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And then crucially, you mentioned Xi, you mentioned Putin. If these forces are real and they are returning, how are we not sort of saying that really that progressivism will have to eventually face and confront reality, and that this will ultimately finish it off? I appreciate that that's rather an uncomfortable thing for us to have to confront, but
Finish what? I finished progressivism off.
yes. Do you think that the return of great power competition could actually be a nail in the coffin for a lot of what you're describing here? But that raises other questions, because you said that there are legitimate grievances amongst a lot of the young, but that will mean that there's going to be less resources to help to deal with some of the structural problems that you're talking about.
Just a quick answer.
Yeah, quick.
Thank you for a great conversation. Ryan Wayne from the Tony Blair Institute. Whatever you think of Thatcher and Blair, I think the two of them undeniably were leaders in the truest sense. They developed a diagnosis of the country. They developed an understanding of the world, both how it was and how it was changing. You may disagree with that. And then they set out governing projects in order to take Britain from one state to a future state. And again, you may disagree with that journey. I guess my question is there still demand for that now? Is it a demand side issue? Or is it a supply side failure that no one is able to offer that governing project? And maybe it manifests in an over-reliance on polls, which then replace political strategy. Or on the demand side, actually what voters are looking for is a leader who puts a mirror up and reflects their grievances, whether that's immigration integration or cost of living. So is it a demand side failure or a supply side failure? And I guess a follow-on question from that is there an opportunity for a post-progressive leader in Britain to set out that diagnosis of the country's decline and illnesses and woes and offer that governing project that maybe transcends left and right and maybe even allows people to find their identity in being part of that project?
I'll answer the last quickly first. Both Thatcher and Blair were great leaders. Blair was a great leader. I mean, a big man in every way, and he typically got some things right and some things disastrously wrong. The problem